My son told me he needed my house before he told me congratulations. That's the sentence I keep coming back to. Not the lie that came later, and there was a lie, a big one. Not the morning I found the eviction notice taped to his apartment door. Not even the Sunday 6 months after all of it, when he knocked on my front door and I opened it and we just looked at each other, saying everything without a single word. No, it all comes back to the order of those words at my dinner table. We need your house. Then, Denise is pregnant. That order told me everything before the conversation even started. My name is Raymond Cole. I'm 67 years old. I live in a craftsman bungalow in the Garden Oaks neighborhood of Houston, Texas, a house I have been building and rebuilding and caring for since I was 36 years old. I was an ironworker for 31 years. I know what it means to put your body into something, to trust the structure you create because you were there for every weld, every beam, every decision. This house is that. It is not just shelter. It is the physical proof that a man showed up, did the work, and didn't take shortcuts. I need you to understand that before we go any further. Because what happened at my dinner table on a humid Saturday evening in October, with the ceiling fan moving slow overhead and the smell of the short ribs I'd been braising since noon, filling the whole first floor, would have looked calm to anyone watching from outside. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a father and his son's wife sitting at a table, having a conversation. But inside that conversation, something was being attempted that I haven't fully stopped thinking about since. I want to tell you this story because I think a lot of people have sat where I sat. Maybe not at a dinner table in Houston. Maybe at a kitchen counter in Detroit, or a back porch in Memphis, or a phone call that came in at an odd hour from someone who needed something that wasn't theirs to ask for. If you've ever felt like your life's work was being appraised by someone who hadn't earned the right to appraise it, this one's for you. My son's name is Marcus. He's 34. He married Denise about 3 years ago, a woman who carried herself like someone who'd always been accustomed to more than she had, which isn't a crime, but it tells you something about the gap between her expectations and her circumstances. I'd watched that gap quietly for the better part of their marriage. The way they moved into an apartment that was slightly too expensive. The car Denise drove that was slightly too new. The vacations they posted online from places that didn't match what Marcus made doing freelance IT work and Denise made doing property management admin part-time. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my business. Until it became my business. They arrived that Saturday with the kind of careful energy that I've learned, after 67 years, always means someone came prepared. Not excited, not relaxed, prepared. Denise set her purse on my entry table and I noticed, even then, that it was a bag I'd never seen before, a large structured leather thing that I later learned cost more than my first month's mortgage payment in 1991. Marcus hugged me with one arm, the way men hug when they're distracted. We sat down. I served the food. And then, before we'd even gotten through the first few minutes of conversation, Marcus set down his fork and said it. "Dad, we need your house." I didn't respond right away. That's important. I want you to understand that my silence wasn't shock, it was calculation. Because in my 31 years of ironwork, I learned that the most dangerous moment on any job site is when something happens that shouldn't, and everyone freezes waiting to see what the other person does next. The worker who panics makes it worse. The worker who stops, assesses, and moves deliberately is the one who keeps everyone standing. I applied that to my dining room table. I set my own fork down. I looked at Marcus, and I waited. He added, almost as if he'd remembered to, "Denise is pregnant. We need more space." Denise reached over and touched his arm at that point, not a celebratory gesture, not the instinctive grab of a woman sharing happy news with a man she loves, a stabilizing touch. The kind you give someone who's delivering a speech they've rehearsed and might veer off script. I noticed that too. "Congratulations," I said. My voice was even. I meant to keep it that way. And then I waited again, because I've learned that if you let a silence run long enough, people will fill it, and what they fill it with is almost always more honest than what they plan to say. Denise spoke first. She gestured at the living room, at the dining room, at the hallway leading to the 3 bedrooms where Marcus grew up, where I nursed his mother through the last 18 months of her life, where I have lived every chapter of my adult existence. "This house has so much space," she said, her voice carrying that specific quality of reasonableness that I associate with people making unreasonable requests. "More than you really need, honestly. For one person, more than I really need." I let that land. Marcus was looking at his plate, not at his wife, not at me at his plate. And in that moment, watching my son stare at the short ribs he hadn't touched, I understood the structure of what was happening. Denise was the architect. Marcus was the material. This conversation had been engineered well in advance, and I was the only one at the table who hadn't been given the blueprints. I turned my eyes to Denise and asked, simply, "What exactly are you proposing?" If you have ever been in a room where someone is asking for something enormous while trying to make it sound like a casual favor, where the ask is dressed up in language designed to make you feel small for not immediately agreeing, you know the specific kind of patience that moment requires. It's not easy. Every part of you wants to respond to the audacity of it, to let your voice carry the weight of what you're actually feeling. But I've been on job sites where the wrong reaction in the wrong moment cost people their lives. I know how to hold. She said it was about family, about helping each other, about stability for the baby, for their future. She said she and Marcus had been thinking about it for a while, and that it just made sense. I had the space, they needed the space. I could find something smaller, something easier to manage at my age. At my age, I am 67. I run 4 miles every other morning. I regrout my own bathroom tile. I built the raised garden beds in my backyard from cedar planks I milled myself. But sure, at my age, I want to pause here and be honest with you, because I said I would be. Sitting there, listening to my daughter-in-law explain why my house made more sense for her life than mine, I felt something. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder and more clarifying, like when a fog burns off and you can see the actual distance between where you are and where you thought you were. The distance between what I had assumed my son understood about how I'd built this life and what he apparently understood was enormous. That distance sat in my chest like a cold stone. "Your child," I said, looking at Marcus until he finally looked up at me, "is your responsibility." Marcus started to say something about how I'd always offered to help if they needed it. And he was right, I had said that. But help and surrender are not the same word. Support and replacement are not the same word. I told him that. I told him I would help him build something, but I would not hand him something he hadn't put a day's work toward. The conversation stretched another 40 minutes. They tried several more approaches: the guilt angle, the practicality angle, the "this is just how families work" angle. I held through all of them. Denise's composure stayed intact, which I kept noticing. Not because a composed person is suspicious by nature, but because a pregnant woman whose housing situation is uncertain, sitting across from her father-in-law who holds the solution, usually shows some seams. Some vulnerability, some real human desperation. There were no seams. They left just after 8 p.m., normal goodbyes, but abbreviated. Marcus hugged me with both arms that time, and I wondered, driving to bed that night, whether that meant something or whether I was looking for things that weren't there. 3 weeks of distance followed. Marcus had been calling every Tuesday for years. It was our rhythm, inherited from the years after his mother died, when I'd made a point of calling him every week, just so he'd know the line was always open. Those Tuesday calls became short texts. "Just busy, talk soon." When I called back, I got practice sentences. "Nothing wrong, just adjusting. Pregnancy stuff. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was, because the updates weren't there. No mention of how far along. No doctor visit stories. No conversation about names, or what the nursery might look like in their 2-bedroom apartment, or whether they were hoping for a girl or a boy. These are the details that leak out of expecting parents without them even noticing. They're involuntary. They come because the news is real and alive in your body, and you can't contain it. There was none of that. I ran into Marcus at a hardware supply store on a Wednesday afternoon, Elgin Hardware on 43rd, where I've been buying materials since before he was born. He was coming out of the fasteners aisle. He looked thinner. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping the way he should. "How far along is she?" I asked, after the small talk had run its course. He shifted the box in his arms, looked at the parking lot. "Early," he said. "Really early. We're not telling many people yet. Early. Just early." I drove home with that word sitting in the passenger seat. That night, at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the kind of quiet that a house full of decades settles into after dark, I laid it all out in my mind like a blueprint. The order of the announcement, Denise's precision, the missing details, the composure that never cracked, the absence of joy. I have built enough structures in my life to recognize when a foundation has been designed to bear weight it cannot actually support. Something here was load-bearing that shouldn't be. I decided I needed to know. The following Thursday, I drove to their apartment complex on the west side, a cluster of beige buildings near the 610 loop that I'd helped them move into 2 years ago, carrying boxes up exterior stairs in August heat that felt like walking into a furnace. I parked in visitor parking. I climbed the stairs. I knocked. Marcus opened the door and went still. Not surprised, still. Caught still. "Is Denise home?" I asked. "She's at work." He stepped back, not inviting me in, just stepping back. I walked in anyway, the way I had 100 times before. But this time, what I walked into stopped me mid-step. The apartment was different, not rearranged different, upgraded different. There was a television on the living room wall that had to be at least 70 inches mounted with the kind of bracket installation that I could tell hadn't been done professionally because the left side tilted 2 degrees. There were 3 structured handbags on the kitchen island, arranged like they were on display in a boutique. The couch was new, a wide sectional in a pale linen fabric that showed no sign of having been lived on. The coffee table was marble, or marble look. Either way, expensive. On a shelf by the window, a collection of decorative objects that I associated with the kind of home staging Denise's part-time real estate office probably did for listings. I stood in the middle of that living room and did the math I'd been refusing to do for weeks. Marcus and Denise, on their best combined month, might clear $5,000. Generously. The television alone had cost at least $2,000. The bags were designer, I didn't know the brands, but I knew from my late wife's sisters what those structured shapes meant. The couch was not a discount store couch. None of this was. Marcus didn't sit down. Neither did I. I turned to face him the way I used to when he was 17, and I could smell something wrong in the air. "Marcus," I said, "is Denise actually pregnant?" The apartment went completely quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. He froze. Not with the confusion of someone who's been asked something absurd. With the stillness of someone who has just heard the question they'd been dreading for weeks, and understands, at last, that there is no longer any runway left. I watched his face. I watched him decide, and then he exhaled a long, slow deflation, like pressure leaving a line, and said, "No." One word. No dramatics, no excuses attached to it yet. Just, no. I want to tell you what that felt like, because I think you deserve to know. I had suspected it. I had driven across Houston on a Thursday afternoon specifically because I suspected it. But suspicion and confirmation are separated by a canyon, and crossing that canyon, hearing my son tell me that he had looked me in the eyes at my dinner table and used the idea of a grandchild as a crowbar to try to pry my home away from me, that crossing took something from me that I'm still accounting for. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, not because I'm proud of my restraint in some performative way, but because I think it matters that the moment didn't become theatrical. He'd already taken enough. I wasn't going to give him my composure too. "Tell me the rest," I said. And he did. They were 2 months behind on rent. 4 credit cards maxed, maybe 5, he said. Like he'd lost count, which told me everything about how they'd gotten there. Car payments on 2 vehicles that were more car than their income justified. And all of this, the bags, the television, the couch, the decorative objects arranged on the shelf purchased in the months leading up to my dinner, like they'd been staging themselves. Constructing an appearance of stability so convincing that they'd nearly convinced themselves. "We thought," Marcus said, his voice breaking in the middle of the sentence, "that if we told you about a baby, you'd want to help. You wouldn't be able to say no." They hadn't been preparing for a child. They'd been preparing a case. I looked at my son, who used to hand me tools in this very city while I worked on weekend projects, who sat on an overturned bucket eating a sandwich while I rewired a junction box, who once told me that watching me work made him want to be someone who built things, and I tried to find the boy inside the man standing in front of me. He was still there, just buried under a lot of bad decisions and someone else's expectations. "You lied to me about a grandchild," I said, "to get my house." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. If you have ever loved someone who disappointed you so completely that the feeling moves past anger and into something quieter and heavier, a kind of grief, then you understand what I was carrying when I walked back down those exterior stairs and into the Houston afternoon. I sat in my truck for a while before I started the engine. Just sat. The city moved around me, indifferent and constant, the way cities do. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table. I thought about his mother, about the years she and I spent building this life, the sacrifices that were so habitual we'd stopped thinking of them as sacrifices. The years of overtime. The vacations we didn't take. The truck we drove until the frame was compromised. The Sunday afternoons we spent in free city parks because entertainment cost money we were saving for a foundation worth standing on. I thought about what she would have said to Marcus that evening. I thought she would have cried. I thought she would have forgiven him faster than I could. I thought that was probably the right call. But it wasn't the call I had in me yet. 3 weeks later, someone taped an eviction notice to their apartment door. I found out from a neighbor of theirs I happened to know one of those small Houston coincidences that a city this size shouldn't allow but always does. I didn't call Marcus. I waited. A text came that evening. "Moving in with Denise's mom for a while. Talk soon." The consequences weren't dramatic. They rarely are. The real consequences in a life are quiet, a lease terminated, a marriage strained past its tensile strength, a version of yourself that turns out to have been unsustainable. Denise and Marcus moved in with her mother. The financial reality, without my house to absorb it, did what reality always does. It asserted itself. They argued. About money, about the spending, about who had pushed for what and why. Denise, from what Marcus later told me in pieces, didn't want to downsize her expectations. Marcus didn't know how to explain that the expectations had never been funded in the first place. She left on a Tuesday, went back to her mother's permanently, sent him a text that said, in some version, that this wasn't what she'd agreed to. What she'd agreed to, apparently, was a life that looked a certain way. When the looking became too expensive to maintain, the agreement ended. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening about a month after that. His voice was flat and factual. She's gone, moved out. I don't think she's coming back. I let him talk. I didn't offer my opinion of Denise, which required some discipline, because my opinion of Denise had been forming for 3 years and was fairly complete by now. But this was not the moment for it. This was the moment for letting my son hear his own voice say the truth of where he'd ended up. 6 months passed. On a Saturday afternoon in April, my doorbell rang. I was in the backyard turning over the soil in the raised beds, getting them ready for the spring planting. I came around the side of the house, and Marcus was standing on my front porch. No text ahead of time. No warning. Just him, standing there in a plain gray t-shirt with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had been somewhere difficult and had only recently started finding his way back. I opened the screen door. He didn't try to explain. There was nothing to explain that hadn't already been explained. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same chairs, the same afternoon light coming through the window over the sink that his mother had picked out in 1993. I made coffee. We sat with it for a while without talking, which is its own kind of language between people who've known each other long enough. I've got a studio over near Montrose, he said eventually. Nothing special, but I can make the rent. I nodded. Got a steady contract with a medical group. IT infrastructure. It's reliable. Good. I'm paying down the cards. Smallest one first, then rolling the payment into the next one. I looked at him. Where'd you learn that? He almost smiled. You. When I was like 16. You walked me through how you paid off the truck. We sat a little longer. I should have listened, he said finally. Not performed, not rehearsed. Just stated, the way you state a thing you've spent 6 months arriving at. You're listening now, I told him. That's all I said. It was enough. I want to speak to you directly before we close this out, because I think there are a few things in this story that are worth holding on to. The mistake most people make when someone they love asks for too much is that they either give too much or they cut off completely, and both of those choices are a way of avoiding the harder thing, which is holding firm while keeping the door open. I didn't give Marcus my house, but I also didn't give him my silence. I held the line and I left the light on. That combination, boundary and availability, is the hardest thing to sustain when someone you love is hurting themselves. But it's the only thing that actually helps. This story taught me that love is not the same as removal of consequence. You can love someone completely and still refuse to absorb the damage of their choices. In fact, sometimes that refusal is the most loving thing you can offer, because consequences are the only teacher that some lessons require. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Is there someone in your life right now whose struggle you've been absorbing because you love them, and what would happen if you stopped absorbing it and let them feel its full weight? Sit with that one. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think I made the right call from the beginning. Drop a 2 if you think I was too hard on Marcus, that I should have offered more help sooner. Drop a 3 if you've been in a situation like this on either side of that table and you want to share your story. I read every single comment. I mean that. And tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there, because this community stretches further than I ever imagined, and I love knowing you're out there. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel seen, or think about someone in your own life, or just sit a little straighter, please subscribe. This channel is built on stories that are true in the way that matters most. Emotionally honest, unflinchingly told, and always worth your time. I'll see you in the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.